BA in Cognitive Science from the University of California, Berkeley. He also finished a postdoctoral research fellowship in higher education and teaching development. Dr. Fong examines the motivational, psychological, and instructional factors that influence success, achievement, and persistence in post-secondary education, primarily using research synthesis and meta-analytic techniques. Beginning in 2014, Dr. Fong served as the managing editor for the Education Coordinating Group, before becoming the group's associate editor and eventually co-editor in 2017 of the coordinating group. As editor, he works closely with the co-chairs and advisory board to expand the progress and impact of our group. In addition, Dr. Fong is active in mentoring the next generation of editorial staff members, including associate and managing editors. He is also an active author of systematic reviews, and in this capacity, as both author and editor, he is here today to discuss updating systematic reviews on autism and employment interventions. Carlton, are you ready to go? Oh, excuse me. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat, and at the end, we can have both chat and oral questions being addressed. Go ahead, Carlton.
Great. Thank you, Joanne. It's a pleasure to be here with you all, and I'm excited to share about our process of updating systematic reviews, particularly focused on the one that we just completed on autism and employment interventions. So before I begin, I just want to recognize those in the disability coordinating group. You just met Joanne Starks from AIR, who's serving as one of our co-chairs. And we also want to acknowledge Oliver Vent, who is serving alongside Joanne as co-chair. I am the editor of the disability coordinating group. We have an associate editor, Brian Reichow from the University of Florida, a methods editor, Derek Rogers from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and our managing editor, Ashima Mohan. So just a little brief background about the DCG or the Disability Coordinating Group. Our key objectives are to undertake and maintain high quality and timely reviews, particularly focused on interventions, but broadly speaking, research in general aimed at improving the quality of life and outcomes of individuals with disabilities. We're also focused on establishing and maintaining a network of those with disability expertise and experiences interested in developing, contributing to disability-related systematic reviews, or serving as peer reviewers, rather. We also are interested in encouraging involvement of people with disabilities, their family members, and other stakeholders in all steps of the review process, particularly focused on developing and disseminating appropriate user-friendly interpretations of reviews or knowledge translation work. And as Joanne mentioned, we're also committed to training and mentoring for those interested in the systematic review process, particularly producing Campbell reviews and evidence gap maps in the disability area. So what is a systematic review update and why is it important? So I didn't find a formal definition of a systematic review update, but this first bullet point kind of outlines my thinking on it, which is taking an existing review and updating the review procedures to produce a more recent snapshot of the available evidence. And I thought of a couple reasons why it's important to undertake a systematic review update. I think the first rationale, and it's a little perhaps discouraging to think of it this way, but a review is old the day after you complete your study search strategy, right? So once you complete, an electronic database search, reviewing some great literature, doing that whole search process, it's become dated, right? It's up to the point in which you complete that search, but the next day there could be a brand new potentially included study in your synthesis that you probably may have missed at that point because you've already completed your search. So in a way, reviews are time stamped, right? They're kind of set. They're bound to a particular time frame, and this kind of leads to rationale number two, that the nature of evidence changes, and this is how science works. Science changes and evolves when the evidence changes. I think we've grappled with that quite personally during the pandemic, right? When we've witnessed, right, the evidence and the science around COVID-19 changing. When new evidence comes to light, right, we're going to change our behaviors and our responses to the pandemic based on growing evidence. And I think that's a part of science that we really need to embrace and really need to celebrate. So when it comes to systematic reviews, it's really important to acknowledge that this is the nature of the scientific process, right? And we really want the best, most recent, most up-to-date evidence to make decisions and ultimately improve lives. In our case, rationale number three comes into play because the review that we wanted to update was actually an empty review. We didn't find any included studies. We didn't find studies that met our inclusion criteria for our synthesis. So we wanted to really see if there was new evidence that had been generated on this topic about 10 years later, right? We were thinking, okay, a decade has passed. Is there new studies that are there that can inform the evidence base that we wanted to examine? So our update is a little unique in the fact that we actually wanted to update two systematic reviews simultaneously. So the two prior reviews you'll see on this slide were conducted by John Westbrook et al. In 2012 and 2013. The 2013 review, if you can decipher the title, it focused obviously on employment outcomes and persons with autism spectrum disorders, but the focus was more on pre-graduation transition services, so those moving from school to work transitions. But if you look at the second review done in 2012, those are focused on adult employment assistance services, so those beyond the school to work transition already. But once again, the second review also focused on individuals with autism spectrum disorders, or ASD for short, and also those intervention effects or services, those service effects on employment outcomes. So the disability was the same across both of these, and the types of interventions as well as the outcomes were similar. It was just kind of the age or the time period of the individuals involved that varied between these two reviews. And in this case, both reviews were actually empty. So we thought we could update both simultaneously because I was an author on both of these prior reviews. And while doing the systematic reviews, reviewing the titles and abstracts as well as the full text, me and the other co-authors, we noticed that, wow, we're actually reviewing pretty much the same literature in both of these reviews. And so why don't we just, in an update, why don't we combine them so we're not necessarily doing two separate ones that have a large amount of potential overlap, at least in the initial stages of the review process. So that third citation on the slide, this is the update that we conducted and was recently published a month or two ago. So we're going to go through some of the steps that we took to update this review. And once again, keep in mind that we're doing it a little differently because we're simultaneously updating two that are significantly overlapped in its foci. So keep that in mind as we go along. So I'll now go through the process of how we updated these now systematic reviews, two of them, into kind of one combined update. So some of the preliminary steps, we reached out to the coordinating group editor and the editor-in-chief to discuss our idea. At the time, I was still serving as the disability coordinating group editor, which I still am. So it would have been obviously a conflict of interest to have the disability coordinating group edit and manage this review. So we reached out to the education coordinating group. So Sarah Miller of that group and Dr. Welch of our editor-in-chief, we discussed our idea and they liked that we were going to update these reviews. Once again, in our case, we were able to confirm with these editors that we would bypass the title and protocol stages because the titles and protocols for both prior reviews were essentially not really changed, right? We were taking those procedures that we had pre-registered both in the title and the protocols and merely replicating them, right? We were redoing them and seeing what new information could be yielded after those search dates of both reviews. We also discussed that we were doing something a little unique where we were combining both Westbrook et al. Reviews as the basis from which we were going to update this new review. And this was important, this next step, and this was kind of part of the combining process, which was making sure that the inclusion criteria and our search strategy was the most, I'm sorry, I should have said inclusive, the most inclusive to encompass the scope of both reviews, because we were combining both. And so we had keywords from both of these reviews that overlap, but also some that were unique. Some that were unique to the population of interest, right? Whether it was school to work transition or adults, we wanted to include the whole range of individuals examined in both of those reviews. So we had to combine the inclusion criteria and the search strategy in the most meaningful and inclusive way. So we could confidently say we've updated both of these reviews using both of the search strategies and both of these sets of inclusion criteria, so that nothing would really fall through the cracks in the ways in which we were kind of integrating our procedures together from both of these reviews. With financial support and a new review team, we began our update with the premise that we would do the most kind of inclusive combined systematic review update from these two prior reviews. So similar to a regular systematic review, we defined our inclusion criteria and our search strategy. For our research design, we were interested in RCTs, randomized controlled trials, and QEDs, quasi-experimental design studies. Once again, for our participants, they were individuals with an ASD diagnosis, and any age group was included because we weren't dividing up those that were kind of adolescent school to work as well as adult individuals. They were really open to any age group. The interventions were those services or programs that were designed to improve employment opportunities and outcomes for individuals with ASD. The outcome, I think, is important to note that we were only including studies that measured gainful employment, right? Gainful employment outcomes. And so this was an important outcome because many studies have examined perhaps more proximal variables in this literature, things like social skills, interview skills, job training skills, which are all important, right? They're all necessary, but they're perhaps more intermediate variables, right, that are really important to improve and enhance. But if studies aren't measuring whether individuals have been employed or not, then the more important outcome that has more meaningful outcomes later on were neglected. And so we really wanted to make sure that was a focal inclusion criteria for our review, which is obviously extended from the prior reviews that we're updating. For publication status, of course, we were open to both published and unpublished and gray literature. So we kept that broad as recommended by Campbell, and we didn't have any language restrictions and used language translation services when necessary. For our search strategy, we updated some of the electronic databases, working with some search specialists. We had observed that some of the databases we used before had become obsolete, or there were some more robust databases that included the older ones, but also included some newer databases in its groupings. And so working with our search specialists, we actually designed a more inclusive search strategy than what was used before in the two reviews. And so once again, we had an eye towards replication and update, but in that process, we were like, let's improve it, right? Let's improve the already inclusive search strategy of combining, but actually do a broader search with additional databases. And so, yes, we made our work more difficult, but in doing so, we thought we did a more expansive and rigorous search strategy through an update of the search procedures. So once we did that, we kind of went through our information retrieval process. And so, yes, our very broad inclusive search yielded over 20,000 titles and abstracts. We removed studies prior to 2008, so that that was the end of the search strategy for the earliest review of the two. And so we just focused on the 13,000 or so that were newer from 2008 and on. We screened those 13,000 titles and abstracts. We double screened them, and we rejected quite a bit because many of them were not empirical studies of autism and employment. And so with our broad search, there were many studies that came into our fold, but ended up being irrelevant. We ended up with around 300 potentially relevant and appropriate studies based on their titles and abstracts alone. And that led us to examining their full text documents, where we could, with greater attention and scrutiny, look at the inclusion criteria. Even at that point, a very large percentage of them were ultimately excluded because they were not meeting all of the inclusion criteria that we had discussed earlier. And so we ultimately ended up with 3 that had the appropriate design, the appropriate interventions, and ultimately the outcome. Like I said, many studies have looked at other important variables and constructs, whether it's well-being, whether it's other integration variables, other quality of life variables, employment tangent variables like interview skills, social skills, all tremendously important for the population of interest and even the outcome of interest, but not the specific employment outcome that we had set out in our criteria. So with 3 studies, that's when we made an intentional pivot, and a pivot that I think we were ready to make, which was not conducting a meta-analytic investigation or a meta-analytic review where we would quantitatively aggregate the effects of these 3 included studies. 3 is relatively speaking, in the grand context of meta-analytic reviews, is definitely on the smaller side. And so it probably would have not been reasonable and appropriate to meta-analyze the effects of just 3 studies. So we opted, once examining the evidence, the pool of studies, that we would take more of a narrative approach in reviewing these 3 studies that focused on employment interventions for individuals with ASD. So in coding these 3 studies, we focused on characteristics of the study, the author, the year of publication, the method or the design of the study, whether it was an RCT or QED, and aspects of those designs, the setting, whether it was school-based, whether it was community-based, perhaps a hospital setting, aspects of the participants, whether it was their age, their type of diagnosis, the intervention itself. So aspects of the intervention, kind of the core components of these interventions, the duration, intensity, etc. For the outcome, our primary outcome, like I mentioned a couple times now, was employment, whether they were gainfully employed, but we also coded secondary outcomes like hours worked, wages, etc. And then we also coded effect sizes. In this case, they were, for the primary outcome, they were odds ratios, because these studies treated employment as a dichotomous or a binary outcome, right? Whether they were employed or not. And so rather than a standardized mean difference like a Cohen's D or Hedges G, which would capture the effect size of a continuously defined variable, these were binary and dichotomous, 0, 1. So we use odds ratios. And then we also coded for risk of bias as well. And so briefly, I'll mention some of our findings from these 3 studies. So the first study we found, Wayman et al., actually all 3 were RCTs, and Wayman et al. Examined the efficacy of Project Search, which is a 9-month internship model where individuals with ASD undergo various periods of different internships. They kind of rotate through some couple week-long internships and really gain some valuable experience through those internships. And they actually found quite large and important effects with the odds ratio of over 4, right, which was quite large. Smith et al. Was another RCT with a different approach. They had a pretty focused training using VR, virtual reality. So pretty cool technology being used here, but to simulate job interviews. And this type of training was also found to be fairly effective as well. And Wayman et al. 2017 actually had a second study that met our inclusion criteria. I am hearing a little bit of scuffling. I wonder if it's someone in our audience here. There we go. Okay. They unmuted, they muted. So Wayman et al. 2017 was another RCT, and they also looked at Project Search, but they included some supplementary components as well. And so they integrated some ABA or applied behavioral analysis techniques in addition to the internship model that they examined back in 2014. And so they added these extra supports. And once again, they also found quite meaningful effects of their intervention. So overall, there is, I think, promising results from a relatively small amount of studies, and based on our assessment of risk of bias, there seem to be likely risk of bias across all 3 studies. So while there were a few studies with, I think, large and significant effects, there also was high risk of bias as well. So kind of some takeaways from our review. I think the main takeaway was updating the review yielded new understanding, right? When these 2 reviews were published back in 2012 and 2013, they were empty, right? There was no experimental evidence of the effectiveness of employment interventions for the population of interest. And while it was important to do those reviews, I think it was a little dismaying, right, that there wasn't this type of robust evidence to support the employment outcomes of individuals with autism. And so setting out to do this update, it was important for us to consider the new evidence that had been generated. And indeed, there were 3 studies that have now met our inclusion criteria that we had set out back in, I think, 2007, 2008. And so that was a really kind of like watershed moment for us, where we were able to see that, this is a difficult field, right, to conduct research. It's difficult to recruit participants. It's difficult with a low incidence of autism to conduct these kind of large-ish trials compared to single case research designs. So we recognize, right, it's not an indictment on the field that this is slow going, right? And this is really difficult, really time consuming, yet really important work to do these primary studies examining these interventions. And they're longitudinal, right? They do a year-long program, they do a semester-long, 6-month-long program, and then they see, right, the longitudinal outcomes of their employment, right? These aren't studies that just occur in a laboratory, right? And so we know that doing this work is very time consuming. And so the fact that 3 studies have been generated in the span of perhaps 10 years since our initial search, we're hoping that this growth can ultimately be exponential in the and the ways that intervention studies can proliferate beyond this point. Ultimately, there were a few studies still, and in the grand scheme of things, they had small sample sizes. And so once again, we discussed some of the challenges just with low incidence of ASD in the larger population. But ultimately, they did have small sample sizes. And so we want to, of course, recommend that larger collaborative studies, perhaps across sites, across locations, can be conducted, where larger studies can be investigated through that. And then once again, they had high risk of bias in a lot of the bias categories that we examined. And so we do want to caution that. But we do want to acknowledge still that there were large effects, right? Many of these interventions had over 90% of their participants gainfully employed for those that participated, compared to maybe like 6 to 10% in the control group. And so we do see some promising results from these interventions. so we want to recommend more experimental studies. There are still not a ton out there, but we are respectfully grateful for the 3 that have been generated thus far. Actually, there's a 4th because Smith, the first author of the Smith et al. 2015 paper, actually, when he read this review, he said, "We have one coming out this year that just got accepted." And we're like, that's for the next update whenever we get around to that. We still need to catch our breath from this one, but there's more evidence, which is really exciting, and we're perhaps with greater wherewithal, we'll conduct our next update soon. And so we encourage, right, more funding for these types of studies where there can be high quality longitudinal looking at gainful employment outcomes, really tracking and following up with individuals for the long term. That's the kind of research that's going to be the most impactful, at least in this topic area. And also technical assistance to support the employment for individuals with ASD. We see the emergence of new technology with new supports complementing older models. And so I think greater innovation in these areas will be exciting to see as we look at future employment interventions for individuals with ASD. I do want to give some more information if you are new to Campbell, or if you're interested in doing your own review, doing an update perhaps. Please, if you're interested in disability related topics, please email us at the email address provided at the first bullet point, disability@campbellcollaboration.org. Of course, take a look at our journal, Campbell Systematic Reviews, for all sorts of instructions and details about the review process. And also, if you're interested in being a peer review candidate as well, peer reviewer candidate, please email us at disability@campbellcollaboration.org. We're always looking for people that are interested in peer reviewing and also just being involved in our disability coordinating group community. So do reach out if you are interested. Some other resources, of course, the journal, as well as our resource center on campbellcollaboration.org. There's wonderful training resources, videos on the website, and of course, all the guidelines to conduct a review are provided on our websites as well. So do check out these resources. And last but not least, here's our contact information. I apologize, our managing editor is no longer Audrey, but it's actually Ashima from the first slide, but it's the same email address with disability@campbellcollaboration.org. And thank you so much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Carlton. This was a really interesting presentation, and it's wonderful that in the time that's passed since the original reviews were conducted, that, excuse me, you were able to find some experimental research onward and upward. So now we can take some questions from our audience. Feel free to put your question in the chat, or if you prefer, you can unmute yourself to ask your question verbally. So go ahead and I'm sure we must have a couple of questions. Patrick LaBelle is raising a hand.
Yes, hi.
Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Carlton, for the very interesting presentation this morning. I was just curious as to the decision in making an update rather than including the previous studies done in the 2 other reviews, just in terms of synthesizing what's been done overall on the topic over the years. And I just wondered what the rationale was for making that decision to just focus on what's been published since, I guess.
Yeah, that's a great question. Once again, in our case, there were a few I don't want to say anomalies, but just unique situations where actually both of those reviews were empty that we were updating. So they identified no studies for inclusion. And so there was, so this is the extensive set of evidence, these 3 studies actually, even before 2008 as well. So that being said, we couldn't, include the old studies because there weren't any included old studies based on our relatively stringent criteria, and that they had to measure gainful employment outcomes. That being said, we definitely incorporated literature in our narrative, in our literature review and rationale and justification that spanned both kind of more contemporary reviews and literature, but also some of the more foundational work that we had included in the prior narratives of those reviews. But in terms of the actual included studies, both prior reviews had none. And so these 3 are it for now, at least from our systematic review perspective.
Sorry, yes, thank you for reiterating that. I did catch that, but when I was phrasing my question, I guess I totally forgot that you had mentioned that already. And I guess as a librarian and an information specialist for Campbell, I guess shocked at the same time as you are in terms of the previous reviews not finding anything. But thanks for explaining that again. Thank you.
No, and it actually was, it brought back just like really endearing memories, actually, because back in 2008, I was a brand new graduate student working on these reviews. And my mentor at the time was John Westbrook, and he was giving us the direction of these reviews, and I would be searching, the literature and reviewing abstracts and full text, and I would like run to his office when I thought I found one that that could be included, and he was like, no, they're not really measuring the outcome that we're interested in. And I just remember like on multiple occasions like printing out the PDF and like putting it on his desk and being like, I got one, like on a Post-it, and he'd be like, nope, because it didn't meet our design criteria or the outcome criteria. And so that just brought back those memories of him and of that process. And so we were surprised too, and I was surprised and was fighting for some of these studies to be like, could this one be included back then. And so yes, thank you.
Well, thank you very much. We have a question from Howard White. Can you elaborate the difficulties for doing studies with children and young people with autism and how they may be overcome?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Given our focus, I guess I'll start with kind of our caveat is that given the fact that we were focused on employment outcomes, that in general, school-age children, wouldn't be involved in these studies, right? Because I'm doubtful that many people would be trying to get them gainfully employed, at least at the school age level. But we did find the Smith study. I'm trying to think now. The Smith study. Let me just double check. I didn't switch them around. Yes. Okay. So the Smith study worked with adults. I think the average age was around 25. And the Wayman et al. Studies, I think their average age was around 19 to 20. So they're kind of at the, post-secondary college age to work, school to work transition. And so nothing really, pre-18, right? Those weren't really the population as we think about employment outcomes. And so when it comes to children, I guess it depends on how you define children, but just want to clarify kind of like the age groupings of the focus of our reviews. But yes, definitely working with school to work populations. Yeah, I think there are going to be challenges. I think it's a complex set of decisions, right, that need to be made by caretakers, by family members, by the individual themselves, of how they want to move forward with work, right? And so I think there are kind of holistic considerations that need to be made. And there's been some not so great practices in this field too, right? Where individuals with autism are treated from very deficit-oriented perspectives. And I think those definitely need to be overcome if our goal is to support and empower. So I think some biases, some wrong and perhaps harmful practices need to be kind of undone as we think about supporting individuals with disability and autistic individuals as well. So.
Well, thank you. Do we have any other questions out there in our audience? I guess you covered everything so well, Carlton, that no one has any questions. Oh, wait, here we go. This again is from Howard. It's a comment, not a question. We are working on a youth employment study. A lot of the interventions are high school age with life skills necessary. I'd expect this to be more common for children with disabilities, not less, but perhaps not evaluated.
Yeah, that's interesting. Thank you. I mean, I'm excited to see how that turns out. Yeah, so I'm interested to see if there's like I said, kind of a comparison between more of these like proximal outcomes related to employment, perhaps these, skill-based outcomes versus like the more distal like employment outcome. So that'd be interesting to kind of compare those findings. So.
I'm not seeing any more questions coming up, but please do feel free to raise your hand or put your question in the chat. We still do have a few minutes left. I'm not seeing any more questions. So again, feel free to follow up afterwards by email with the addresses that Carlton has provided for us. We're very happy, Carlton, to have you here today to discuss this process. I think people know what a systematic review is, but they may not necessarily understand all the nuances involved in doing the update. So I think that's been very helpful to share your process as well as what you found. And I think it also reflects on just the area of disability and rehabilitation as well, where there's so many things are very unique to specific individuals that it's harder to do some of these larger scale studies with larger populations. And that's also reflected in what you've shared with us today. So we have time for if one more question might have come up. If not, we'll go ahead and thank everyone for coming today. And I also want to be sure to acknowledge that the Campbell webinar series is made possible by the generous support of Campbell's core funder, AIR, or the American Institutes for Research. AIR also supports review and dissemination activities of the Disability Coordinating Group. One last chance for a question. And Carlton, do you have any closing words?
No, thank you so much. I'm grateful for the support to conduct the update, and just want to remember and honor John Westbrook's legacy from these reviews, and also his foundational involvement in the Campbell collaboration. So
Thank you very much. Yes, also he was instrumental in getting the Disability Coordinating Group started, and we appreciate your help with getting everything going with that, Carlton. Thank you.